All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. To those who are watching online, we're glad you're here too. My name is Luke Stair. If we have not met, Dr. Wiles is at camp. So I'm going to go ahead and pray, and as we pray, we will also pray for youth camp, which is going on. Father, thank you for this time to gather together, and as we study your word, help us learn more about you and what life in a relationship with you is like. We also pray for all of our students and workers at camp, that you are at work in those students' lives, that you are calling them deeper into relationship with you, that they are learning to follow you for the first time maybe, or maybe you are just calling some students to ministry, calling students to follow you more closely. We thank you for all that you are doing. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, well, we have another just super straightforward, easy passage in Genesis. There should be no questions today. It's just light, right? Okay. If only. So we are in Genesis chapter 22. I'm going to read through this. I know my outlines are a little more scant than Dr. Wiles' outlines tend to be. But we are going to work through this chapter together. So if you turn to Genesis chapter 22, that's where we are today. So I will start reading for us. So, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son from me, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Okay. No theological questions here. I think we're done. We're going to work through this together because there is a lot at play in this text. And obviously, this is a text that has captured the imagination for centuries. This is a significant text not only for Christians and Jews, but the Muslims will actually rewrite this in the Quran. And instead of Isaac being sacrificed, it's Ishmael. So this is a story that has captivated the attention of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. It obviously captivates us in different ways, but it is a significant story among what are known as the Abrahamic religions. So we have a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack. So if you'll remember back a couple of chapters ago, you may be wondering, why is Isaac called Abraham's only son? Right? This doesn't make sense. So if we think back a couple of chapters ago, Ishmael and Hagar get kicked out. And not only do they get kicked out, Ishmael gets disinherited. So now Ishmael is no longer Abraham's son in a legal sense. So this is continuing that train of thought. Ishmael has been kicked out. He's been kicked out of the will. He's no longer a son, effectively. So when he says, your only son Isaac, effectively, Isaac is Abraham's only son. Ishmael is no longer his heir. Make sense? So this is kind of in a very legal sense. So obviously, biologically, Ishmael is still Abraham's son. But for all intents and purposes in this text, he's not anymore. So that's that one question resolved. Why is Isaac the only son when we remember Ishmael? It's because he's been kicked out, not only of the household, but also out of the will. Then we get to this testing. God tests Abraham. What an interesting concept for us. Why does God test? We're going to talk more about this through the text, but that's what we start off with. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. So the Hebrew word here is nisah, which you don't need to know the Hebrew, but this is referring to a test of character. This is not like what third graders in Texas do when they sit down to take the star. This is a test of character. And so God tests throughout the Bible, and we'll talk about some of that. But here we have a test. We're going to talk more about the purpose of that testing as we move along. So some things I want to talk about first that we don't necessarily think about living in 21st century America. Child sacrifice was a very common practice in this region and at this time. It was incredibly common, and we know actually throughout the Old Testament that there are times that the Israelites will adopt Canaanite religious practices. So we know that they're told to not give in to Baal worship or do these other things throughout the Old Testament. Canaanite worship routinely had child sacrifice as a part of what it did, and we know that there are times later in the Old Testament when God's chosen people will adopt Canaanite religious worship practices. They'll worship Baal. And part of that would have involved child sacrifice, and that actually gets mentioned directly. God condemns his people for child sacrifice in Ezekiel 23:39, and again in 2 Kings 17:17. So there are times Israel will later adopt child sacrifice in its own religious practice, and God will condemn it. So Abraham may not have been surprised by the fact that God was asking for child sacrifice, because it was just part of his world. So what would have been hard for Abraham is that the child that's being asked to be sacrificed is his one and only beloved son. So what's hard about this for Abraham is not the practice of child sacrifice itself. It's likely that it's his only son. So obviously we know that child sacrifice is going to be something that God is going to outlaw. So some people, some scholars point to this text as a way of effectively God is proving, and we'll get there, God is proving that he's not a God who wants child sacrifice. So some scholars will look at this text and say, what is at work here is God is saying, I'm not like the pagan gods that other people worship. I'm not a God who wants child sacrifice. So some people will say this test is about demonstrating God's character, in demonstrating that God is not a God who desires child sacrifice. So he's going to provide the ram instead. So that's something we need to think about, though, that child sacrifice is part of this world. It's part of this time. It's very different from where we live and what we do. Right? None of you have ever attended a child sacrifice. I didn't think so. If you had, we would need to be having some different conversations today. So, a word about testing, too. I don't know if any of you have ever been teachers. I know at least we have one former teacher in the room. I know we have others. Sometimes when you tested kids, Did you already know what they knew? Yeah, so sometimes as a teacher, you test a child, you already know what they know. The test is both for you to prove what they know, but it's also to help the child understand what they know. Or sometimes in relationships, if you've ever been married, sometimes your relationship with your spouse undergoes testing. Hopefully you're not inflicting that test upon your spouse. Sometimes we do that. But if your relationship has ever undergone testing, you know that sometimes this testing is something that grows your relationship. So if we think about testing and what gets described about testing elsewhere in the Bible, I would point you to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18. Someone else who gets tested by God, and this is from the NRSV, and this is talking about Jesus in Hebrews 2:18, about Jesus. Because he himself was tested, this is again about Jesus, by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. So we know throughout the New Testament, throughout the Bible, when we talk about testing, testing is something that helps us grow in our faith. Jesus was tested, so testing is not necessarily this evil, manipulative thing. So there are a lot of times when people who want to kind of poke holes at the Bible and point to, oh man, God is an angry, violent, vindictive God, they'll point to this passage and say, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his child. How could a good God do that? Testing has a lot of different roles in Scripture. Even Jesus was tested. And we're going to talk more about that later too. So when you hear that word testing, just keep that in mind. So let's move on to verses 3 through 8. So God comes to Abraham. Abraham says, "Here I am." That actually sets up a parallel in the text. So if you notice in verse 1, he says, "Here I am." He says it again in verse 11. That's kind of, there's some hinges in the text here. There's some artistry. Remember, we're reading the work of brilliant artists who are telling the story of God in a beautiful, true way. So, "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son." And so they get up, they load up the donkey. He takes with him 2 servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. So another interesting thing. This is Abraham's last conversation with God. So after this, God is not going to talk to Abraham again. Abraham's story is coming to a close. So what happened in the first conversation with Abraham and God? What did God say? Get up, go, take your family. Now here in this last conversation, God again says, go and take your son to the place I will show you. In Genesis 12, God said, get up, take your family to the place I will show you. So we have this beautiful parallel between God's first conversation with Abraham and God's last conversation with Abraham. They're not things we necessarily immediately think about as we're reading this story and thinking about many, many weeks ago when we read Genesis chapter 12. But there is a parallel here between the first conversation and the last conversation. So Abraham gets up, they go, they walk with their servants. 3 days later, meaning Abraham has sat and walked and traveled with his son for 3 days, thinking about what God has asked him to do. They find the mountain. They go, Abraham takes the wood and places it on his son, this sacrifice, and then this son carries the wood up the mountain. Does that sound vaguely familiar to anyone else? Okay. So another thing that's happening in this passage, if we think about the entire Bible as pointing to Christ, what's something that's happening here? Do we see a foreshadowing of what's to come? Okay. So another thing I would point out about this testing and what's happening in this text, remember that just not long ago, Abraham got called a prophet, which is not something we normally think of Abraham as, is a prophet. And if we think about prophets in the Bible, one of the things that they do are these strange actions. So for, Hosea gets told to marry a prostitute as this prophetic sign and enactment, or Ezekiel has to lie on his side for an entire year. So prophets sometimes get asked to do some pretty strange things as a way of demonstrating and telling what God is going to do. So what some scholars have pointed to is that this passage in Genesis 22 is a prophetic action. Abraham doesn't necessarily know that he's engaging in a prophetic action, but as Christians, we know that this is a prophetic text in a way, because here, this sacrificial son is going to carry wood on his back up a mountain, and God is going to, but ultimately this son will not be sacrificed. Isn't it interesting, too, that God is not asking Abraham to do something that he himself will not do? God is going to do the very thing that he has asked Abraham to do in this passage. So, when we think of this passage through the lens of prophetic reenactment or enactment, the question isn't, how could God ask Abraham to do something so horrible? It's, what is God asking us to learn through this text? So, when we think about the strangeness of this passage, think about it through that prophetic lens, just like you would think as you read Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, that there are some things here that are symbolic and are ultimately foretelling things to come, showing the truer way. So we know that God asks him to do this. Isaac carries the wood up. I think it's interesting that Isaac asks, why is this here? But Isaac ultimately trusts his dad and he trusts God. He doesn't resist. And isn't it interesting, too? I don't think Abraham is lying in verse 8. Abraham answers Isaac's question and says, God himself will provide the lamb. Abraham has been interacting with God. He knows God's character. He knows what God is like. He knows that this son is the way forward for the blessing that God has promised. That this is the one through whom all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham has been promised numerous descendants, and this is his only son. Abraham trusts God. He trusts that God has a way through this. So we know that in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, the author of Hebrews says that Abraham believed that God could even raise Isaac from the dead. So Abraham believes that God has a way through this, that God is either going to provide a lamb in Isaac's place, or that God could even raise Isaac from the dead. Think back to what God says to Sarah when she laughs. Is anything too hard for God? And I think that's what's going through Abraham's mind. Is anything too hard for God? He's asked me to sacrifice my son, but I know what God's character is like. This is the way forward for the blessing. Surely God is at work. Something greater is happening. God will make a way through this. So even if I kill my son, God could raise him from the dead. God can provide a lamb instead. So I think Abraham is genuine in verse 8 when he says to Isaac that God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And so they go on together and they build the altar. Abraham binds Isaac, lays him on the altar, gets the knife at the ready. This is a very dramatic scene. It's been depicted in art throughout the centuries. Again, this story has captured the imagination. And then the angel of the Lord calls out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Again, kind of paralleling verse 1. Abraham, again, paralleling verse 1, says, here I am. And God says, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And Abraham looked up. And again, this kind of looking up parallels what happens in verse 4, where Abraham looks up and sees the mountain. Now he looks up and he sees the ram caught by its horns. So he goes over and he sacrifices the ram in the place of his son. Abraham calls that place, the Lord will provide. So if you've ever heard the phrase Jehovah Jireh, this is where that phrase comes from. So, the angel of the Lord comes to Abraham and restates the initial blessing. That Abraham will be blessed, that he will have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the seashore. This is something we've heard before, but the blessing gets reiterated in this last conversation, that Abraham's descendants, that this blessing is secure. So what do we do with this question of kind of makes it sound like God didn't know what was going to happen, because God says, now I know. Theologians have done a couple of different things with this. So I don't know if you are aware, there's a kind of group of Christians who would say that God doesn't know the future. And sounds very heretical. I don't believe this view. I sympathize with it. There's a lot in it that I admire. What I admire about it is it attempts to take Old Testament passages like this at face value. Because there seem to be times in the Old Testament that God says things like he doesn't know what's going to happen. This is one of those cases. So this is a view called open theism. Again, I admire a lot about it. I wish I believed it. I don't. But effectively, they would say God doesn't know the future because the future doesn't exist yet, so there's nothing to know. God is still omniscient because he knows everything. There's just no such thing as the future yet, so God doesn't know that. He has a good idea. He knows fully what's in the present, but he doesn't know the future because there's no such thing as the future, which again is a kind of a philosophical tack. But what they're doing is they're trying to take the Old Testament passages like this at face value, that there seem to be times God doesn't know what God is going to do, that God changes his mind, that God doesn't know what's going to happen, or he gets bartered down. So when you see that, there is a group of Christians who will say God genuinely did not know what was going to happen here, if Abraham was going to pass this test or not. And they're saying that because on face value, it seems like God doesn't know something, which is a problem if you think that God knows everything. So that's one way of reading the text. That's not how I read this text. But you will find, if you were to go pull even commentaries out of our resource library, you would find commentators who hold that view. I read one this morning that holds that view. A very prominent Old Testament theologian named Walter Brueggemann, who gets cited often. Great scholar, he holds that view. So you'll find this if you dive into much Old Testament scholarship especially. But I think God knew. I don't think God learned anything he didn't already know. What I think is happening here is God is kind of reframing this covenant. That there is this, Abraham is the one. Abraham is the person I knew Abraham to be. That he is the one who is blessed, that will carry this forward. This is not new information to me, but now I know, I think is an emphatic way of saying, restating, I know who Abraham is. I know who I chose. I know who will carry this blessing forward, whose descendants will be as numerous as the sea. So those are the two views. I think Dr. Wiles would agree with me on view number 2. I don't think I'm overstepping there by saying that. He's not an open theist. We've had conversations about this. But there is a way of reading the Old Testament. It's there. Again, you could go to our resource library and pick up numerous books on the Old Testament, and you would find that expressed there. So if for some reason you were to wander into our resource library today and check me on what I've talked about, now you would know that it's there. You would not be surprised. But you'll find people who think that. They're still within the realm of orthodoxy, even though their view is not large. Okay, they still believe God is going to reign ultimately and completely. I just don't think they're right. So, okay, that is this kind of chunk of narrative here. We get another little kind of small chunk at the end of Genesis 22. And really the point of that narrative, those very few final verses, is just to tell you where Rebekah comes from. Because Rebekah is about to come into the story as Isaac's wife. And so that little chunk is really just there to show you she is not the daughter of a concubine. She is a very legitimate, well-bred woman. So if you were, someone who liked Pride and Prejudice, if you've ever read those books and they talk about someone being a well-bred woman, effectively that is the Old Testament version of this. Rebekah is a woman of high standing. She's about to come into the narrative. This is where she comes from. She's not just some Joe Schmo woman who's about to come onto the scene and be Isaac's bride. She is integrally tied to the story. So that's the end of that. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to our online crowd. I'm sure there are questions about today, so if you have questions, thank you for holding those. Our online crowd, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next week. Dr. Wiles will be back. But